Tupac Shakur lived like he knew his time was running out. At 25, he'd already made 5 albums, starred in 6 movies, survived 1 shooting, spent time in prison, and become one of the most influential artists of his generation. People around him said Tupac had a darkness he couldn't shake. A certainty that he wouldn't live to see 30. In February 1996, during a radio interview that was never broadcast, Tupac explained why. What he said in that interview predicted his death 6 months later with terrifying accuracy. Los Angeles, February 1996. Tupac Shakur walked into the studios of a popular hip-hop radio station for what was supposed to be a standard promotional interview. He was there to talk about his latest album, about upcoming projects, about his record label Death Row. The usual celebrity interview format. Soft questions, promotional soundbites, maybe a freestyle if the mood was right. But from the moment Tupac sat down in front of the microphone, it was clear this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. The host, a veteran radio personality named Marcus Thompson, had interviewed Tupac multiple times over the years. They had a rapport, a comfort level that allowed for deeper conversations than the typical surface-level promotion most artists did. Marcus had watched Tupac evolve from a backup dancer and supporting actor into one of the most compelling voices in hip-hop. He'd interviewed Tupac during his rise, during his legal troubles, after his shooting in 1994. They had history. Trust. The kind of relationship that allowed for honest conversation. Marcus opened with a simple question about how Tupac was doing, what he'd been working on, how life was treating him after getting out of prison just 4 months earlier. Tupac's answer stopped Marcus cold. "I'm living on borrowed time, man," Tupac said, his voice quiet but intense, that distinctive rasp carrying an edge Marcus hadn't heard before. "Every day I wake up, I'm surprised I'm still here. I don't think I'm gonna make it to 30. I've accepted that. Made peace with it." Marcus laughed uncomfortably, thinking Tupac was being dramatic, creating a persona for the interview, playing into the troubled artist narrative that sold records and magazines. But Tupac didn't laugh. He just stared at Marcus with those intense eyes that seemed to look right through people, past the surface into something deeper. "I'm serious," Tupac said, leaning forward slightly. "I can feel it. Death is close. It's been close since I was born, but now it's right there. Right behind me. I can see it in the mirror sometimes. I can feel it when I'm alone. It's not a metaphor, Marcus. It's real." The interview continued, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly different about Tupac that day. He seemed tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Haunted by something he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Like he was carrying a weight that was getting too heavy to bear but couldn't be put down. About 20 minutes into the interview, after Tupac had talked about his recent album, about the creative process, about working with various producers and artists, Marcus shifted topics. He asked Tupac about the violence in hip-hop, about the East Coast-West Coast rivalry that was dominating headlines and threatening to tear the entire genre apart. Tupac's response was detailed, specific, and in retrospect, absolutely chilling. "They're gonna kill me in a car," Tupac said matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather or predicting rain. "Not in a studio. Not at home. Not in some random place. In a car. Probably after some big event. When I'm feeling good, feeling like I'm on top of the world. That's when they'll do it. Drive-by shooting. Multiple shooters. They'll make sure I don't survive this time. They'll make sure there's no coming back from this one." Marcus tried to redirect, to lighten the mood that had become oppressively dark. "Come on, Pac. You're talking like you've got a death wish. Like you want this to happen." Tupac shook his head slowly, deliberately. "Not a death wish. A death certainty. There's a big difference between wanting something and knowing something. I don't want to die. I want to live. I want to make music. I want to make movies. I want to see my kids grow up. But wanting and getting are 2 different things. And I know, deep in my soul, that I'm not gonna get what I want. He continued, describing scenarios with unsettling precision that made Marcus's skin crawl. He talked about being in Las Vegas, a city he visited frequently for boxing matches and parties. About being in a BMW, the kind of car Suge Knight drove, the kind Tupac was often riding in. About the shooting happening at night, late, when the streets were still crowded but attention was divided. About it happening after a major boxing match, when everyone's adrenaline was high and guards were down. About a white Cadillac, the kind that gangs in Los Angeles preferred for drive-bys because they were common and unremarkable. Marcus stopped taking notes. Stopped asking follow-up questions. Just let Tupac talk, let him get whatever this was out of his system. Because what Tupac was describing wasn't vague premonition or artistic metaphor. It was specific. Detailed. Methodical. Like he was reading from a script of events that hadn't happened yet but somehow already existed in complete form. The crazy thing is, Tupac said after a long pause, staring at something Marcus couldn't see, I'm not scared of dying. I've died before. Symbolically. Spiritually. I died in that hospital in 1994 when they shot me. I died in prison. I've died so many times already that the physical death is just gonna be one more in a series. What I'm scared of, Tupac continued, his voice dropping even lower, is what happens after. What they'll say about me. How they'll twist my story. Turn me into something I wasn't. Make me a martyr or a villain or a cautionary tale. That's what keeps me up at night. Not the dying. The being remembered wrong. The having my words and my life used for purposes I never intended. The interview lasted 90 minutes total, nearly double the scheduled time. By the end, Marcus was visibly shaken, his hands trembling slightly as he shut off the recording equipment. When it was over and Tupac stood to leave, Marcus stood too, wanting to say something, to offer some kind of help or comfort or intervention. But what do you say to someone who's just described their own death in detail? Tupac seemed to understand Marcus's struggle. He put a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Don't worry about me, man, Tupac said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. I've made my choices. I know what I'm doing. This is the path I'm on. Just remember me right when it happens. Tell people who I really was, not who they want me to be. When Tupac left the studio that February afternoon, Marcus sat alone in the recording booth for over an hour, listening back to the tape, trying to process what he'd just heard. He'd done thousands of interviews in his career. Talked to rappers, singers, actors, athletes, politicians. He'd never heard anything like this. The certainty in Tupac's voice. The specificity of the details. The resignation to a fate Tupac seemed to believe was inevitable. Marcus made a decision that night, sitting in his car in the parking lot, unable to drive home yet. The interview wouldn't air. It couldn't air. It was too dark. Too intense. Too disturbing. If it went public, people would think Tupac was suicidal or mentally unstable. It could trigger a psychiatric hold. It could hurt his career, damage his relationships, cause his record label to drop him. It could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, with people treating Tupac like he was dying, making the death more likely. So Marcus locked the tape in a storage cabinet at the station and never mentioned it to anyone. Not to his producers. Not to his colleagues. Not even to his wife. 6 months later, on September 7, 1996, everything Tupac described in that interview came true with horrifying precision. Tupac was in Las Vegas for the Mike Tyson vs. Bruce Seldon boxing match at the MGM Grand. The fight was over in 109 seconds, Tyson knocking out Seldon in the first round. After the fight, Tupac and his entourage, including Death Row Records CEO Suge Knight, got into an altercation with a gang member in the MGM lobby. Security cameras caught the whole thing. Tupac and his crew beating a man on the casino floor. Afterwards, they left the MGM to change clothes and head to a nightclub where Tupac was supposed to perform. Tupac was riding in a black BMW 750 sedan driven by Suge Knight. They were heading down Las Vegas Boulevard toward the club. It was 11:15 p.m. The streets were crowded with pedestrians, cars, the usual Las Vegas Saturday night chaos. They stopped at a red light at the intersection of Flamingo Road and Koval Lane. A white Cadillac pulled up on the passenger side where Tupac was sitting. Someone in the Cadillac opened fire. 14 shots. 4 of them hit Tupac. 2 in the chest. 1 in the arm. 1 in the thigh. The Cadillac sped away. Suge Knight, grazed by a bullet fragment, drove Tupac to the hospital, running red lights, the BMW weaving through traffic. By the time they arrived at University Medical Center, Tupac had lost massive amounts of blood. Doctors fought for Tupac's life for 6 days. He underwent multiple surgeries. His right lung was removed. He was placed in a medically induced coma. His mother, Afeni Shakur, flew to Las Vegas immediately. Friends visited. Suge Knight posted guards outside the hospital room. But on September 13, 1996, at 4:03 p.m., Tupac Shakur died of respiratory failure and cardiac arrest. He was 25 years old. Marcus heard the news like millions of others. On television. The breaking news alert interrupting regular programming. Tupac Shakur, rapper and actor, dead at 25 from gunshot wounds sustained in Las Vegas shooting. Marcus felt the room spin. Felt his stomach drop. And then he remembered the tape. The interview from February. 6 months earlier. He left his house immediately, drove to the radio station even though it was Saturday and he wasn't scheduled to work. He went straight to the storage cabinet where he'd locked the tape. His hands were shaking as he pulled it out. He went into an empty studio, closed the door, and played the recording. Tupac's voice filled the room, describing his own death in detail. The car. The drive-by. Las Vegas. After a big event. Multiple shooters. Marcus listened to the entire 90 minutes. By the end, tears were streaming down his face. Not just grief for Tupac's death, though that was profound. But something else. Horror. Disbelief. The impossible realization that Tupac had known. Had described it. Had predicted it with accuracy that seemed supernatural. Marcus sat in that studio for hours, replaying sections, taking notes, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Had Tupac been warned? Had someone told him there was a plan to kill him? Was this evidence of a conspiracy? Or was it something else? Something stranger and sadder. A young man so trapped in a cycle of violence that he could see the trajectory clearly and knew exactly where it led? Marcus ultimately made the decision to lock the tape back in the cabinet. To tell no one. Because what good would it do? Tupac was dead. The interview predicting his death would only fuel conspiracy theories, hurt his family, turn genuine tragedy into sensational spectacle. It would be used by people with agendas. Twisted to fit narratives. Turned into evidence for theories ranging from plausible to absurd. Marcus decided the tape would stay hidden. Tupac's final detailed confession would remain private. The tape stayed locked away for 7 years. Marcus left the radio station in 1999 for a job in another city, another market. He never told his replacement about the tape. Never mentioned it in his goodbye speech or his exit interview. The storage cabinet remained untouched until 2003, when the station underwent a major renovation. They were clearing out old equipment, old files, decades of accumulated material. A junior producer named James was assigned to go through boxes of old interviews and decide what was worth keeping, what should be digitized for archives, what could be thrown away. James found the Tupac tape on a Friday afternoon. The label just said, Tupac Shakur, February 1996, do not air, in Marcus's handwriting. James, who'd been in high school when Tupac died and had only a vague memory of the controversy surrounding his death, was curious. He took the tape to a working studio and played it. What he heard disturbed him deeply. Not because he understood the full context, but because even without context, Tupac's words were chilling. The certainty. The detail. The resignation. James brought the tape to his supervisor, a woman named Linda who'd worked at the station since the early 90s and remembered Marcus. Linda listened to the tape and immediately understood why Marcus had hidden it. She also understood that 7 years after Tupac's death, the ethical calculation was different. This wasn't an act of danger to Tupac's mental health or safety. This was history. Evidence. A window into Tupac's state of mind in his final months. Linda tracked down Marcus, who was living in Atlanta and working at a sports radio station. The phone call was difficult. Marcus explained his reasoning for hiding the tape. He'd been trying to protect Tupac, to prevent the interview from being weaponized, from being used as proof that Tupac had been suicidal or reckless with his own life. But 7 years later, with Tupac's legacy already complex and contested, Marcus wasn't sure anymore if he'd made the right choice. The decision of whether to release the tape became a major ethical debate at the station. Meetings were held. Lawyers were consulted. Tupac's estate was contacted, though they were not cooperative and did not want the tape released under any circumstances. Some staff argued it was newsworthy, that the public had a right to hear Tupac's words, that it shed important light on his death and the circumstances surrounding it. Others argued it was exploitative, that releasing it would only cause more pain for Tupac's mother and family, that it would fuel endless conspiracy theories without providing any real answers. The compromise reached was imperfect but pragmatic. The station would not publicly broadcast the full audio recording. But they would allow journalists and biographers working on Tupac-related projects to listen to the tape under controlled conditions and quote from it with proper attribution. Transcripts of key sections would be made available to serious researchers. But the sensational elements, the detailed predictions, would not be turned into promotional content or entertainment. Despite these precautions, excerpts from the interview leaked within months. By 2004, portions of the transcript were circulating on early internet forums dedicated to Tupac and hip-hop history. Fans dissected every word. Conspiracy theorists built elaborate frameworks around Tupac's predictions. Some claimed the tape proved Tupac had faked his own death and was living in hiding. Others claimed it proved the FBI or CIA had targeted Tupac and he'd been warned. Still others used it as evidence of a music industry conspiracy to eliminate artists who became too powerful or too political. But there's another interpretation, one that's less sensational but perhaps more tragic. Tupac didn't predict his death through supernatural means or insider knowledge of a conspiracy. He understood, with brutal clarity, the reality he was living in and the trajectory he was on. By early 1996, Tupac was at the center of the most violent and public feud in hip-hop history. The East Coast-West Coast rivalry had escalated from competitive to genuinely dangerous. Rappers on both sides were making threats. Guns were being brought to industry events. Shootings were happening with increasing frequency. Tupac himself had been shot 5 times in November 1994 during a robbery at Quad Recording Studios in New York. He'd survived, barely, through a combination of luck and the shooter's poor aim. That experience fundamentally changed him. Made him paranoid. Made him certain that people wanted him dead. And he wasn't wrong. Death threats were constant. Enemies were real and numerous. The violence was escalating in ways that anyone paying attention could see leading toward tragedy. So when Tupac described his death in that February interview, he wasn't channeling psychic visions or revealing insider information about a murder plot. He was articulating the most likely scenario given the world he lived in, the conflicts he was engaged in, and the patterns of violence he'd observed. A drive-by shooting. Multiple shooters. After a public event when his guard might be down. In Las Vegas, where he went frequently. In a car driven by Suge Knight, who he was always with. These weren't prophecies. They were statistical probabilities described by someone smart enough to see patterns and honest enough to admit what those patterns meant. Tupac was also deeply intelligent, far more than the thug persona he sometimes performed suggested. He'd attended the Baltimore School for the Arts as a teenager, studying theater and ballet alongside rap. He read voraciously, philosophy, poetry, revolutionary literature. He thought deeply about mortality, legacy, power, violence. He understood that the life he was living, the conflicts he was engaged in, the persona he'd created, all of it was leading toward a violent end. He could see the trajectory as clearly as a mathematician seeing the inevitable conclusion of an equation. And in that February interview, he was articulating what he knew intellectually but couldn't change behaviorally. He was trapped in a cycle that he understood was going to kill him but felt powerless to escape. People close to Tupac confirmed this in interviews years later. His mother, Afeni, said Tupac had been talking about death constantly in early 1996. Not just in that one radio interview. In phone calls with her. In conversations with friends. In lyrics he was recording. He told his fiancée Kid Ada Jones to be prepared for his death, that he didn't think their future together would be long. He revised his will multiple times between January and September 1996, making sure his affairs were in order. This wasn't one eerie prediction in a single interview. It was a pattern. A sustained preoccupation with death. A man coming to terms with his own mortality in real time, trying to prepare the people around him for what he believed was inevitable. The February interview wasn't unique. It was just the most detailed and recorded example of something Tupac was doing constantly in his final months. But the specificity still haunts people who've heard the tape. Las Vegas. A BMW. After a boxing match. A white Cadillac. Multiple shooters. How could he have known those exact details unless he'd been specifically warned? Unless someone had told him the plan? The answer might be simpler than it appears. Las Vegas was where Tupac went for big events. He'd been to dozens of boxing matches there. BMWs were what Suge Knight drove exclusively. Tupac was in Suge's car constantly. White Cadillacs were the vehicle of choice for Los Angeles gang members doing drive-bys. Multiple shooters were standard for any serious assassination attempt to ensure the target didn't survive. Tupac was describing the most likely scenario using details from his own life, his own routines, and the patterns of gang violence he'd observed and studied. He wasn't receiving information from the future. He was extrapolating from the present with heartbreaking accuracy. The interview also reveals Tupac's mental state in February 1996, and it's devastating. He was exhausted. Burned out. Paranoid but not irrationally so, given the genuine threats he faced. He'd just been released from prison in October 1995 after serving 8 months on a sexual assault conviction he maintained until his death was unjust. He'd signed with Death Row Records to secure his release, but the deal came with obligations he was already regretting. Suge Knight was a powerful and dangerous figure who didn't tolerate disloyalty or disobedience. Tupac was also financially trapped despite his fame. Legal fees from multiple trials had bankrupted him. He owed money to Death Row. He had family members and friends depending on him financially. His mother Afeni was dealing with her own health and financial issues. Tupac couldn't just walk away from the music industry or the conflicts he was in. He needed to keep working, keep recording, keep touring, keep making money. And that meant staying in exactly the situations that were putting his life at risk. The tragedy of Tupac Shakur isn't just that he died young. It's that he saw his death coming and felt powerless to prevent it. That February interview, hidden for 7 years and still not fully public today, reveals a man trapped by circumstances he'd helped create but could no longer control. Trapped by fame. By debts. By conflicts. By a persona he'd built that had taken on a life of its own. "I'm Tupac, but I'm also playing Tupac," he said in the recording, a distinction that gets to the heart of his tragedy. "And the character I created is gonna get me killed. I know that. But I can't stop playing the part because too many people depend on me. My family needs the money. My crew needs the protection my name provides. The fans need the music. I'm stuck being this person even though I can see exactly where it's leading. 27 years later, Tupac's murder remains officially unsolved. Las Vegas police investigated but never made an arrest. Multiple people have been suspected over the years. Theories abound, ranging from straightforward gang retaliation to elaborate industry conspiracies to government involvement. The truth is probably simpler and sadder than any conspiracy. Tupac died because he was caught in a cycle of violence that he understood intellectually but couldn't escape practically. The February 1996 interview exists in radio station archives now. Portions have been shared with biographers, journalists, filmmakers working on Tupac documentaries. But the full 90-minute recording has never been publicly released out of respect for Tupac's estate and his mother, who died in 2016 never having heard the tape but knowing it existed and opposing its release. Those who have heard it describe the experience as both eerie and heartbreaking. Eerie because of the impossible accuracy of Tupac's predictions. Heartbreaking because it reveals a brilliant young man who saw his own death approaching and felt powerless to change course. The tape is a window into Tupac's final months, into his mindset, into the trap he found himself in. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold stories about the moments that made legends truly legendary. Hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear about the weight of fame, the inevitability of violence, and the tragedy of a brilliant life that ended exactly as its owner predicted.